My husband of 30 years stood on a stage, held up a gavel, and auctioned off a day of my life to the highest bidder. "Let's start small," he laughed. "For the most useless woman in the world, how about $1? As the elite of the city roared with laughter, I stood there in the silence of my own broken heart. He thought he was selling my dignity for $1, but he forgot one thing. I was the one who built the foundation he was standing on, and I was about to pull the rug out from under him. Let me tell you how it all began. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive orchids and even more expensive perfume, but to me, it felt like oxygen was running out. This was supposed to be the 30th anniversary gala of Gray Holdings, a celebration of 3 decades of growth, grit, and supposed partnership. I had spent weeks meticulously planning every detail, from the hand-lettered place cards to the seating arrangements that ensured David's biggest investors were flanked by the most charming company. I had done it all while wearing a navy silk dress I'd tailored myself, a 10-year-old piece I'd updated because I couldn't justify spending $5,000 on a designer gown when our latest development project was facing a minor cash flow hiccup. That was the Madison Gray way: frugal, invisible, and always putting the empire first. David stood under the spotlight, looking every bit the real estate king of California in his bespoke Italian tuxedo. His hair was perfectly silvered at the temples, his smile practiced and blinding. For years, I had mistaken that arrogance for confidence. Tonight, the mask hadn't just slipped, he'd thrown it into the fireplace. He looked down at me from the podium, his eyes glittering with a cruel, intoxicating power. He wasn't just drunk on the vintage Bordeaux. He was drunk on the realization that he no longer felt he needed me. To him, I was a relic of his startup years, a used ladder he was ready to kick away now that he'd reached the roof. "Come on, gentlemen," David shouted, waving the gavel toward the crowd of 200. "Don't be shy. Think of the benefits. She's an expert at clipping coupons and making a single pot of pot roast last an entire week. She doesn't have hobbies. She doesn't have expensive tastes, and she certainly doesn't have an opinion. She's the perfect silent partner, mostly because she has nothing interesting to say." Another wave of laughter rippled through the room. I saw Sarah, a woman I had consoled through her own messy divorce just last year, hide a smirk behind her champagne flute. I saw Bill, whose first mortgage David and I had personally guaranteed when no bank would touch him, chuckling and whispering to his younger trophy wife. I didn't move. I didn't cry. My father, a man who worked 40 years in the shipyards of Long Beach, always told me that a Gray never gives an enemy the satisfaction of seeing them bleed. I kept my chin level, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, observing the spectacle as if I were a stranger watching a poorly written play. I looked at David, really looked at him. I saw the tiny tremors in his hand, the way he adjusted his silk tie too often. He was performing for these people because he was terrified of them. He needed their laughter to feel alive, whereas I had learned long ago to find my strength in the quiet hours of hard work. "Going once for $1, David's voice took on a mock-serious tone, the tone he usually reserved for closing multi-million-dollar land deals. "Going twice? Does no one want a piece of history? Or is she just that depreciated?" He raised the gavel high, his face contorted in a sneer of pure, unadulterated triumph. He wanted to break me. He wanted to see me run from the room in tears so he could tell everyone tomorrow that poor Madison finally lost her mind. He was waiting for the snap. The silence in the room became heavy, a vacuum of anticipation. I felt the heat of the stage lights on my skin, but inside, I was ice. I thought about the secret ledger in my safe at home. I thought about the years I'd spent quietly correcting his aggressive accounting errors, and the bridges I'd built with the city council while he was busy playing golf. He thought he was the architect of this life, but he was just the flashy paint on a house I had built, brick by brick, with my own hands. Just as the gavel began its descent, a sharp, resonant click of heels echoed from the back of the hall. The heavy oak doors swung open, cutting through the laughter like a blade. a man stepped into the light, tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than David's entire car collection, and carrying an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. It was Silas Thorne, the ghost of Wall Street, a man David had been chasing for 6 months in a desperate bid to save Gray Holdings from a looming debt crisis. David froze, the gavel hovering midair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Silas didn't look at the stage. He didn't look at the bar. He walked straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked onto mine with a gaze that felt like a recognition of an old debt. He stopped just a few feet from me, ignored my husband entirely, and spoke in a voice that was calm, deep, and carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. $10 million, Silas said. The gavel fell from David's hand, clattering loudly against the wooden floor. I stood there, feeling the cold sting of 30 years of loyalty being sold for $1. If you've ever felt invisible or undervalued by the people you love most, please hit the like button and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. It helps me know I'm not alone in this storm. As the gavel clattered to the floor and the room descended into a stunned, suffocating silence, the $10 million from Silas Thorne felt less like a bid and more like a thunderclap. I didn't look at David. I didn't need to see the way his jaw had dropped or how the smug, wine-flushed color was draining from his face, replaced by a sickly, panicked gray. Instead, my mind did something strange. It retreated. It fled from the suffocating luxury of the Fairmont, away from the judgmental eyes of the San Francisco elite, and traveled back 30 years, to a time when $10 million was a number that didn't even exist in our vocabulary. I found myself thinking about the smell of cheap pine sol and the constant, dull ache in my lower back, the ghosts of the woman I used to be before I became the useless ornament David decided to auction off for $1. In 1994, we didn't have a corporate empire or a mansion in Pacific Heights. We had a 600-square-foot apartment in a drafty corner of Oakland, where the heater groaned like a dying animal every time the fog rolled in. David was 24, bursting with an ambition that was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. And I was 22, convinced that my purpose in life was to be the fuel for his fire. Back then, Gray Holdings was just a stack of blueprints on a grease-stained kitchen table, and a dream that everyone told him was impossible. But I believed. Oh, how I believed. I took on 3 jobs so he could focus on networking, a word that, back then, just meant him sitting in diners trying to convince contractors to give a kid with no collateral a chance. I worked the early shift at a local bakery, spent my afternoons filing papers for a grumpy accountant, and spent my nights waitressing at a 24-hour diner where the tips were thin, but the coffee was free. I remember one night vividly, a Tuesday, I think. David had managed to land a lunch meeting with a major developer the next morning, his first real, big break. He was pacing our tiny living room, frantic because his only decent shirt had a frayed collar, and he didn't have a jacket that didn't look like it came from a thrift store bin. He looked so small, so desperate for a seat at a table that didn't want him. I didn't tell him that I had been skipping lunch for 3 weeks to save up for a new pair of work shoes, because the soles of mine had worn through to the pavement. I just went to the closet, pulled out my secret jar of emergency grocery money, and walked 4 miles in the rain to a department store. I bought him a crisp white shirt and a navy wool vest that made him look like the success he hadn't yet become. When I got home, soaking wet and shivering, he didn't ask how I bought it. He just put it on, looked at himself in our cracked mirror, and smiled that same smile I saw on the stage tonight. The one that says, "I deserve this," without ever acknowledging who paid the bill. That was the foundation of our marriage. My invisible labor, my calculated sacrifices, and his escalating ego. I was the one who stayed up until 2 a.m. clipping coupons from the Sunday paper, making sure every cent was squeezed until it bled, just so we could afford the filing fees for his first LLC. I was the one who learned how to fix the plumbing ourselves, because we couldn't afford a handyman. And I was the one who spent my weekends walking door to door with him, handing out flyers for a company that didn't even have an office yet. I didn't mind the calluses on my hands, or the fact that I hadn't bought a new dress in 3 years. To me, we were building a legacy. We were living the American dream, the one where you start with nothing, work until your bones ache, and eventually find yourself standing on top of the world. I thought we were climbing that mountain together, hand in hand. What I didn't realize then was that while I was building a home, David was building a pedestal for himself. Every time I stepped back to let him shine, every time I stayed in the shadows so he could take the credit at a city council meeting, I was inadvertently teaching him that I didn't matter. I became part of the furniture, reliable, sturdy, but ultimately beneath his notice. He grew to resent the very frugality that had saved us from bankruptcy 5 times in the first decade. To him, my habit of turning off lights in empty rooms, or mending a loose button instead of buying a new coat, wasn't a sign of the discipline that built his wealth. It was a peasant mentality that embarrassed him. He wanted a wife who looked like she was born in a ballroom, not one who remembered the taste of generic brand cereal and the fear of a past due notice on the door. Standing there on that stage tonight, listening to Silas Thorne's staggering bid, I realized that David hadn't just auctioned me off because he thought I was worthless. He did it because he wanted to erase the only person left who knew the truth about him. He wanted to kill the memory of the kid in the Oakland apartment who had nothing, and he thought by humiliating me, he could finally step out from the burden of our shared past. He looked at my navy dress, the one I'd tailored myself to save us money we didn't even need to save anymore, and he didn't see loyalty. He saw a reminder of a struggle he wanted to forget. But as Silas Thorne stepped closer, his eyes fixed on mine with a startling intensity, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in 30 years. Not just anger, not just hurt. It was the cold, hard realization that the useless woman who built his empire was the only one who actually knew how to tear it down. David had forgotten that you can't have a penthouse without a foundation, and I was done being the dirt beneath his feet. Standing there under those blinding stage lights, looking into Silas Thorne's eyes, I realized that the universe has a very long memory. David's face was a mask of twitching confusion, his mind likely racing to calculate how he could pivot this humiliation into a business win. But my mind was 25 years in the past, back to the moment the useless wife narrative was born. You see, every lie David told about me tonight, every joke about my failed financial sense, was built on a secret I had carried like a lead weight in my chest for a quarter of a century. It was 2001. Gray Holdings was no longer a dream on a kitchen table. It was a hungry predator. David had tasted his first real success, and it had changed him. He stopped talking about we and started talking about I. He traded his navy wool vest for Italian silk and his empathy for a spreadsheet. I remember him coming home one evening, his eyes wide with a predatory light I'd never seen before. He'd found a distressed property in a neighborhood that was about to be rezoned, a small, sun-drenched corner lot occupied by a struggling community center and a small bakery owned by a widow named Clara Thorne. "It's a gold mine, Maddie," he'd said, pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch. "The woman is drowning in debt. I found a way to trigger a foreclosure through a secondary lender. We can scoop it up for pennies, bulldoze the place, and put up luxury condos. We'll make millions before the first brick is even laid." I visited that bakery the next day. I didn't see a distressed asset. I saw Clara, a woman with flour on her apron and kindness in her eyes, teaching local kids how to bake after school. She was the heart of that street. She told me, through tears, about the shadowy company that had bought up her debt and was suddenly demanding payment in full. She didn't know the man behind that company was the same man I shared a bed with. That night, I looked at David across our dinner table and felt a chill. He wasn't just building an empire. He was willing to destroy lives to do it. At the same time, I had just received a modest inheritance from my father, the man who had worked the shipyards. It was exactly $100,000. To David, it was seed money for his land grab. He'd been hounding me to sign it over to him so he could finalize the Thorne foreclosure. Think of it as an investment in our future, he'd pressured me. Don't be emotional, Madison. This is how the world works. I made a choice that night, the most dangerous choice of my life. I didn't sign the money over to David. Instead, I went to a lawyer I knew from my days as a clerk. I set up an anonymous trust. I paid off Clara Thorne's debt in full and gave her an additional $20,000 as a low-interest angel investment to modernize her shop. I did it under the condition of absolute anonymity. When David found out the Thorne property was no longer for sale because a mystery benefactor had cleared the debt, he was livid. He threw a crystal glass against the wall, screaming about the millions he'd lost. He turned to me, his face red with fury, demanding to know where my father's inheritance was so he could pivot to another deal. I looked him straight in the eye and told the great lie. "I'm so sorry, David," I whispered, forced tears pricking my eyes. "I tried to double it. I put it all into that tech startup Bill mentioned, the one that went bankrupt yesterday. It's all gone. Every penny." The look of pure, unadulterated contempt that crossed his face in the moment never truly left. To David, losing money was a sin worse than murder. From that day forward, I was no longer his partner. I was the financial liability. He used that failure as a leash for 25 years. He used it to justify taking away my credit cards, to justify giving me an allowance like a child, and to justify the constant, soul-eroding jokes at dinner parties about how Madison couldn't manage a lemonade stand, let alone a bank account. I let him believe it. I leaned into the role of the frugal, slightly dim-witted wife who spent her days clipping coupons and tailoring old dresses. I let him think he was the sole genius of the Gray family because it kept him from looking too closely at what I was actually doing. While he was out playing Titan of industry, I was quietly monitoring that angel investment. I watched from afar as Clara Thorne's little bakery grew into a regional chain, and then into something much, much bigger. I watched as her son, Silas, grew up with the best education that my failed investment had made possible. David thought he was the architect of our wealth, but he didn't realize that his entire empire was built on a foundation of sand, while I had been building a fortress in the shadows. He had spent 30 years mocking me for a loss that was actually my greatest victory. Back in the ballroom, the silence was finally broken by the sound of David's nervous, high-pitched chuckle. $10 million? David stammered, stepping toward Silas Thorne with an oily smile. "Mr. Thorne, I knew you were a man of grand gestures, but surely, for my wife? This is quite the joke." Silas Thorne didn't smile back. He didn't even acknowledge David's outstretched hand. He kept his eyes on me, eyes that were filled with a 25-year-old debt of gratitude. "It's not a joke, Mr. Gray," Silas said, his voice like cold iron. "In fact, I think 10 million is a bargain. After all, I'm not just buying a day of her time. I'm finally meeting the woman who saved my family's life when a shark tried to drown us." David's smile froze. The room gasped. And for the first time in 30 years, I let the useless wife mask slip. Just a fraction. The silence that followed Silas Thorne's words was so thick you could have cut it with one of the silver steak knives on the banquet tables. David stood frozen, his hands still half extended in a pathetic, orphaned gesture of greeting. His eyes darted from Silas to me, then back to Silas. searching for the punchline of a joke that wasn't coming. The real estate king looked suddenly very small, like a child who had realized the playground bully he'd been mocking was actually the principal's son. "Saved your family?" David finally choked out, a nervous, sweating tremor underlining his words. "Mr. Thorne, Silas, there must be some mistake. My wife, Madison, she hasn't handled more than a grocery budget in 3 decades. She lost her entire inheritance on a failed tech venture back in the early 2000s. She's sweet, but she's not exactly a savior of anything other than a clearance rack at Macy's." He tried to laugh, looking around the room for support, but the 200 guests were no longer laughing with him. They were staring at Silas Thorne, the man who held the keys to the kingdom they all wanted to inhabit. Silas didn't blink. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a checkbook, the kind of heavy, leather-bound luxury that signified wealth so old it didn't need to shout. With a gold fountain pen, he scribbled a figure that made David's breath hitch. He tore the check off with a crisp snap, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the silent ballroom, and handed it not to David, but to the Gala's stunned charity coordinator who was standing off to the side. $10 million, Silas repeated, his voice echoing with a terrifying clarity. "Paid in full. Now, per the rules of your own auction, Mr. Gray, the lady's time for the next 24 hours belongs to me. And I've decided our workday begins tonight, with a private dinner. Immediately." David's face went through a fascinating transformation, from confusion to greed, and then to a frantic, calculating desperation. He realized he was losing control of the narrative, but more importantly, he saw an opening. If Silas Thorne was this obsessed with Madison, maybe this wasn't a disaster. Maybe this was the leverage he needed to close the merger that was currently the only thing keeping Gray Holdings from a catastrophic collapse. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, trying to regain his composure. "Well, if you're serious, Silas, a deal is a deal. Madison, darling, why don't you go with Mr. Thorne? I'm sure he has some business advice to give you." He gave me a look, a sharp, commanding glare that told me to play along and, more importantly, to find out how to get that merger signed. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. I stepped off the stage, my heels clicking firmly against the floor. As I passed David, the smell of his expensive cologne and cheap desperation was nauseating. He reached out to grab my arm, a reflex of possession he'd exercised for 30 years, but Silas Thorne stepped between us. He didn't touch David. He simply existed in the space where David wanted to be. It was a silent, professional wall of granite. "We'll be leaving now," Silas said, offering me his arm. As we walked toward the exit of the grand ballroom, I could feel the heat of 200 pairs of eyes on my back. The whispers started almost immediately, a low hiss of gossip that would be all over San Francisco by morning. I saw Sarah and Bill, the people who had laughed the loudest at my $1 valuation, now looking at me with a mixture of awe and terror. They knew the wind had shifted, even if they didn't know which way it was blowing yet. We reached the valet stand, where a sleek black limousine was already idling. The cool night air of San Francisco hit my face, smelling of salt and car exhaust, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could actually breathe. Silas opened the door for me, waiting until I was settled before sliding in across from me. The interior of the car was a sanctuary of soft leather and muted light. As the car pulled away from the Fairmont, leaving the lights of the Gala behind, the silence between us was different. It wasn't the silence of a husband who didn't care to listen. It was the silence of a strategist waiting for the right moment to strike. "You've been very quiet, Madison," Silas said softly, leaning back into the shadows. "Most women would have at least asked where we're going." "I stopped asking for directions a long time ago, Silas," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I looked out the window at the city lights. "I found that if you wait long enough, people eventually show you exactly where they intend to take you. My husband just showed me he's willing to sell me for $1. I'm curious to know why you think I'm worth 10 million. Silas leaned forward, the light from a passing street lamp illuminating the sharp, intelligent lines of his face. I'm not buying your time, Madison. I'm paying back a debt that has accrued 25 years of interest. My mother, Clara, didn't just leave me a business when she passed away last year. She left me a file titled The Angel of Oakland. It took me 6 months to track down that failed inheritance money through the maze of shell companies you set up to hide it from David. You're a very clever woman, Madison. Much cleverer than the man back there deserves. He handed me a leather portfolio. David thinks Gray Holdings is in trouble because of a market downturn. He's wrong. He's in trouble because I've spent the last quarter century making sure that every bank he owes money to eventually ended up under my umbrella. And tonight, I'm giving you the keys to the cage. I opened the portfolio. My eyes scanned the documents, the columns of numbers, the legal jargon I had spent years teaching myself in the middle of the night while David slept. It wasn't just a business report. It was a map of David's complete and utter destruction. I have a dinner reservation at a small place my mother used to love, Silas said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. But first, we have some paperwork to discuss. After all, a $10 million employee should at least know who she's working for. I looked at the signature line on the final page. It wasn't Silas Thorne's name that needed to be there. It was mine. The limousine glided through the fog-drenched streets of San Francisco, a silent predator in a city of secrets. We stopped not at a 5-star Michelin restaurant, but at a small, unassuming bistro nestled on a quiet corner in Noe Valley. The sign above the door read Clara's, written in a delicate, familiar script that made my heart skip a beat. As Silas led me inside, the scent of rosemary and toasted sourdough enveloped us, a stark, warm contrast to the sterile, perfume-heavy air of the Gala. The restaurant was closed to the public, lit only by the soft glow of amber wall sconces. In the center of the room, a single table was set with crisp white linen and a bouquet of gardenias, my father's favorite flower. Silas pulled out my chair with a quiet grace that David hadn't shown me in 20 years. My mother bought this building with the last of the investment you sent her, Madison, he said, sitting across from me. She insisted on keeping the original name, even after the Thorne Group became a multi-billion-dollar entity. She said it reminded her of the day the world stopped being a cold place and started being a home again. He looked around the room, his eyes softening. David Gray looked at my mother and saw a line item to be erased. You looked at her and saw a human being worth saving. He called your inheritance a loss. I call it the most successful venture in the history of the Thorne family. I ran my fingers over the edge of the tablecloth, my mind reeling. For 25 years, I had lived under the shadow of David's mockery, accepting his useless label as a shield to protect the secret of my heart. To hear Silas speak of it with such reverence felt like a dam breaking inside me. I didn't do it for a return, Silas, I whispered, my voice thick with the dust of old memories. I did it because your mother worked until her knuckles were swollen just to keep the lights on. I saw her pride, and I saw my husband trying to steal it to buy himself a faster car. I couldn't let him win. Silas leaned forward, placing a thick, weathered envelope on the table between us. She knew. Even though you stayed anonymous, she figured it out years later. She tracked your life, Madison. She saw the way David treated you at public events. She saw the useless wife persona you adopted. It broke her heart to see her savior living in a cage built by the very man she had escaped. He opened the envelope, revealing a series of legal documents and a handwritten letter. Before she passed, she didn't just leave me a business. She left me a mandate. She spent the last decade quietly buying up the secondary debt that David was so aggressively taking on to fund his vanity projects. He thinks he's a genius because banks kept giving him money. He never realized those banks were selling his soul to me. The weight of his words hit me with the force of a physical blow. While David was out playing the role of the invincible CEO, laughing at my frugality and my cheap dresses, the very woman he tried to destroy was slowly, meticulously weaving a net around him. It was the ultimate irony. David's arrogance had blinded him to the fact that his empire was no longer his own. He was a king of a castle built on borrowed time, and the bill was finally coming due. I looked at the documents. The Thorne Group now held 51% of the institutional debt of Gray Holdings. But there was more. "There's a reason I bid $10 million tonight, Madison," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a low, intense frequency. "It wasn't just to shock the room. That $10 million was the exact inflation-adjusted value of the inheritance you gave my mother, plus the interest David claimed you lost. I didn't buy a day of your life. I returned what was stolen from you." He pushed a final document toward me, a bank charter. My mother's primary asset wasn't the bakery or the real estate. It was Thorne National Bank. In her will, she stipulated that 51% of the bank's voting shares be transferred to you upon her death, provided I could find you and ensure you were ready to lead. Tonight, Madison, you didn't just leave a gala. You became the majority owner of the bank that holds your husband's life in its hands. I stared at the signature line, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. I wasn't just the Angel of Oakland anymore. I was David's boss. Every mortgage, every construction loan, every line of credit that kept Gray Holdings breathing was now under my thumb. The man who had spent 30 years telling me I couldn't handle a checkbook was now my subordinate. A strange, cold calm washed over me. The pain of the evening's humiliation was still there, but it was being forged into a blade of pure, sharp justice. I thought of David back at the Fairmont, probably bragging to some investor about how he managed the Silas Thorne situation. He had no idea that the useless woman he'd sold for $1 was about to foreclose on his entire life. "He'll expect me to come home tonight and tell him how the meeting went," I said, my voice cold and steady. I looked at Silas, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. "He'll expect me to be his spy, to tell him how to get you to sign that merger. He thinks I'm his greatest asset because he believes I'm too loyal to be a threat." Silas raised his glass of wine in a silent toast. "Then let's give him exactly what he expects, Madison. A loyal wife, doting and quiet. Let him sleep soundly tonight, dreaming of his fake glory. Tomorrow morning, when the banks open, he'll find out that the foundation has shifted. And this time, there won't be anyone to save him from the collapse." The drive back to our estate in Atherton was draped in a silence that felt heavy with the ghosts of the last 30 years. In the dim amber glow of the limousine's reading light, I didn't see paper and ink. I saw the anatomy of a murder, the slow, arrogant suicide of David Gray's legacy. Silas had left me with the portfolio, a leather-bound tomb of every mistake my husband had made, while he was busy believing he was too big to fail. As the car wound through the dark, tree-lined streets, I pulled out my reading glasses, the ones David always teased me about, calling them my librarian look. He never realized that behind those lenses, I was a woman who could read a balance sheet like a map of a battlefield. For years, I had played the role of the technologically illiterate wife, the one who struggled with the new banking apps, just so he would feel superior. In reality, I had spent my nights in the guest room, my laptop screen dimmed, teaching myself the intricate language of shell companies, mezzanine financing, and debt-to-equity ratios. The numbers in Silas's report didn't lie, even if David did. David's aggressive expansion was actually a house of cards held together by spit and vanity. He had over-leveraged our primary residences, taken out predatory bridge loans to cover construction delays in San Jose, and, the most damning part, he had been borrowing from the employee pension fund to keep the appearance of liquidity during the last quarter. He was 3 weeks away from a total default. He wasn't looking for a merger with Silas Thorne. He was looking for a life raft for a sinking ship he'd sabotaged himself. I traced my finger over a specific line item. Loan Series 704, collateralized by Gray Holdings corporate headquarters. The lender wasn't a faceless institution anymore. It was Thorne National Bank. My bank. Because David viewed me as a non-entity, he had never bothered to hide his login credentials or his physical files. To him, I was just part of the background noise of his life, like the hum of the refrigerator or the gardener's mower. He'd left the door to his vault wide open because he didn't think I had the intellect to walk through it. He'd forgotten that I was the one who had managed the books of our first 3 properties while he was out making deals over 3 martini lunches. I knew where the bodies were buried because I had been the one who made sure the cemetery was neatly landscaped. The most delicious irony sat on page 42. A personal guarantee, signed by David in his bold, looping script. He had put up his 49% stake in the company as collateral for a secret loan he took out to buy that ridiculous yacht last year, the one he named the King's Ransom. He had literally bet his crown on a boat, assuming the stupid wife would never find out, and the merciful Silas Thorne would bail him out. I felt a cold, analytical thrill run through me. It was the same feeling I used to get when I'd find a stray penny in the laundry. A small victory of order over chaos. Only this time, the penny was a billion-dollar real estate empire. I realized that if I called in the Series 704 loan tomorrow morning, Gray Holdings wouldn't just stumble, it would vanish. And because of the cross-collateralization clauses David had signed without reading the fine print, his personal assets, the cars, the art, the very house we slept in, would be seized. I closed the portfolio just as the limo pulled into our gated driveway. The house was lit up like a palace, a monument to a man who owned everything and possessed nothing. I saw David's shadow pacing behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study. He would be waiting. He would want to know if his Madison had charmed the billionaire. He would want to know if the investment of selling my dignity had paid off. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my old silk dress. My heart was no longer breaking. It was beating with the steady, rhythmic precision of a clock counting down to midnight. I tucked the glasses back into my purse, hidden alongside the bank charter that named me the most powerful woman in his world. As the valet opened the car door, I stepped out into the cool night air. I wasn't just a wife returning from a dinner. I was a sovereign power returning to a colony that didn't yet realize it had been annexed. "Everything all right, Mrs. Gray?" the driver asked, sensing the shift in my energy. "Better than all right, Marcus," I said, giving him a small, genuine smile. The numbers finally added up, and for the first time in 30 years, the math is perfectly in my favor. I walked toward the front door, ready to play the most important role of my life. The mask of the submissive, confused wife was about to become my deadliest weapon. David wanted a show? Well, I was about to give him a performance that would bring the entire house down. The front door of our Atherton estate swung open with a heavy, silent grace, welcoming me back into the museum of David's ego. The house was a masterpiece of cold marble and glass, designed to impress strangers rather than comfort family. I could smell the sharp, peaty scent of his 16-year-old Lagavulin before I even saw him. David was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the formal living room, his tuxedo jacket discarded on a velvet armchair, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked like a man who had spent the last 3 hours pacing a cage of his own making. "Well?" he barked, not bothering to turn around. "Did he give you the check? Or was the $10 million just a stunt to humiliate me in front of the board?" I took a slow, deliberate breath, adjusting the weight of the leather portfolio hidden inside my silk evening bag. This was the moment, the performance of a lifetime. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction, projecting the image of a woman exhausted by a world she didn't understand. He gave the check to the charity coordinator, David. "You saw that," I said, my voice soft, laced with a rehearsed tremor of confusion. I walked to the sideboard and began the familiar, mindless task of straightening the crystal decanters. He took me to a small bistro. He talked a lot about his mother and about the old days in Oakland. He's a very sentimental man. It was quite overwhelming. David spun around, his eyes narrowing. Sentimental? Madison, the man is a shark. He didn't bid $10 million because he's sentimental. He wants something. Did he mention the merger? Did he say why he's been blocking our credit line at Thorne National? He stepped closer, his shadow looming over me. He didn't ask if I was okay after he'd auctioned me off like a piece of livestock. He didn't apologize for the $1 insult. He just wanted the intel. He did mention the bank, I lied, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. I let a small, nervous laugh escape my lips. But it was so technical, David. You know how I am with those things. He kept talking about voting shares and debt restructuring. I told him you were the one to speak to about the business, but he just smiled and said he preferred my company tonight. David's face twisted into a sneer, a mixture of relief and pure, unadulterated contempt. Of course he did. He probably enjoyed playing the big, mysterious savior to a woman who thinks restructuring is something you do to a closet. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh and drained his glass. God, Madison, you really are a blank slate, aren't you? But maybe that's exactly what I need. If he thinks you're harmless, he'll keep his guard down. I want you to call him tomorrow. Invite him here for tea. Use that Angel of Oakland nonsense to your advantage. For a split second, the mask almost cracked. I felt a surge of cold fury so intense, I thought I might actually strike him. He wanted me to use the very act of mercy that saved a family to lure Silas into a trap for his own greed. He was asking me to weaponize my soul to save his sinking ship. I'll do my best, David, I whispered, turning away so he couldn't see the fire in my eyes. I just want things to go back to normal. I'll go upstairs and wash up. I've had enough excitement for one night. Wait, David said, his voice sharp. He stepped toward me, his hand reaching for my evening bag. What's in the bag? It looks heavy. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The bank charter, the loan defaults, the evidence of his pension fund fraud. It was all right there, inches from his hand. I tightened my grip, forcing myself not to pull away too quickly. Just some leftovers, I said, my voice pitch perfect in its domestic banality. Silas insisted I take some of his mother's special sourdough and the dessert we didn't finish. You know how I hate to let good food go to waste. I thought I'd have it for breakfast. David paused, his hand hovering. Then he recoiled as if I'd offered him a bag of trash. Leftovers? At a time like this, you're carrying around bread from a bistro? God, Madison, you really are a peasant at heart. He waved me away with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Go. Get out of my sight. I have calls to make to the board. Try not to get crumbs on the duvet. I walked up the grand staircase, my back straight, my footsteps echoing in the hollow house. Once inside my bedroom, I locked the door and leaned against it, the silence of the room ringing in my ears. I pulled the portfolio out of my bag and laid it on the vanity. In the mirror, I didn't see the useless wife David saw. I saw a woman who had just survived an interrogation by a man who didn't even know he was already dead. I sat down at my small writing desk, opened my laptop, and logged into the secure portal Silas had provided. Watching David laugh at me while I held the power to erase his entire legacy was surreal. He thought I was just doing the dishes, but I was signing his professional death warrant. What would you do? Would you strike immediately? Or let him enjoy his last few moments of fake glory? Drop a comment with the word justice if you want to see him pay for his arrogance. And don't forget to like this video to support my journey. The next morning arrived with a crisp, mocking brilliance that only Northern California can muster. The sun rose over the redwoods of Atherton, casting long, elegant shadows across our breakfast nook, where the scent of freshly ground Kona coffee usually signaled the start of another day of David's conquests. But today, the silence of the house was punctuated by a sound that was rapidly becoming the soundtrack to David's demise: the incessant, frantic buzzing of his encrypted work phone. I sat at the marble island, wrapped in my favorite worn cashmere robe, cradling a mug of tea and watching him through the steam. David hadn't slept. His tuxedo from the night before was crumpled on the floor of his dressing room. and he was currently pacing the kitchen in a silk robe that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, his hair disheveled and his face a sickly shade of parchment. He was on his third double espresso, his hands shaking so violently that the china saucer clattered with every movement. He was staring at his phone as if it were a ticking bomb, his thumb scrolling through a barrage of emails that I knew were written in the cold, unforgiving language of foreclosure. "It's a glitch," David muttered, more to himself than to me. "It has to be a glitch. Thorne National doesn't just call in a Series 704 on a Tuesday morning without a courtesy call. I have a relationship with those people. I play golf with the regional VP." He punched in a series of numbers, his knuckles white. "Pick up, damn you. Pick up." He slammed the phone down on the counter when it went straight to voicemail for the 10th time. He looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching for a target for his mounting rage. "Madison, why are you just sitting there? Didn't you hear me? The bank is freezing the operating accounts. The payroll for the San Jose project is supposed to clear in 3 hours. If those checks bounce, the union will walk off the site by noon." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, savoring the warmth. "I'm sorry, dear," I said, my voice a soothing balm of artificial concern. "You know I don't understand the big business talk. Maybe they're just doing some maintenance. Or perhaps it's related to that restructuring thing Silas Thorne mentioned last night. He seemed very focused on his mother's legacy. Is it possible you missed a deadline?" I tilted my head, offering him the same vacant, supportive smile I'd used for 3 decades. "You always say I should stay out of the man's work, so I just assumed you had everything under control. After all, you're the real estate king, right?" David let out a guttural sound of frustration, a mix of a growl and a sob. "Restructuring? Madison, you don't restructure by cutting off the oxygen to a billion-dollar company. This is a hit. Someone is trying to squeeze me." He grabbed his car keys, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "I'm going to the office. I need to get the board on a call. If Thorne thinks he can play games with me because I let him take my wife to dinner, he's got another thing coming. I'll ruin him. I'll drag his name through every court in the state." He rushed toward the garage, nearly tripping over the hem of his robe. The image of the invincible CEO officially shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I watched through the window as his silver Porsche screamed down the driveway, the tires chirping against the pavement in a desperate, expensive wail. The moment he was out of sight, the doting wife mask fell away, leaving behind a woman who was finally, truly awake. I walked into his study, the inner sanctum he had always forbidden me from entering without supervision, and sat in his oversized leather chair. It felt surprisingly small. I opened my laptop and watched the real-time financial feeds Silas had given me access to. It was a bloodbath. The news of the Thorne National default notice had leaked to the secondary markets, and Gray Holdings stock was into a free fall, shedding 20% of its value in under an hour. David's loyal board members were already jumping ship, issuing frantic no-comment statements to the press. But the most important piece of the puzzle was the document sitting on my screen. A legal injunction, signed by a federal judge at 8:01 a.m., freezing all personal assets of David Gray pending an investigation into the irregularities in the employee pension fund I had flagged the night before. I picked up the house phone and dialed a number I had memorized 25 years ago, but never dared to call until today. "Good morning, Clara's Bakery and Investments." A familiar, warm voice answered. It wasn't Clara, of course, but the tone was the same. "This is Madison Gray," I said, my voice echoing in the empty, opulent room. "Please tell Silas Thorne that the useless wife has finished the housework. The trash has been moved to the curb. I'll be at the bank headquarters in 1 hour to sign the final transition papers." I hung up and went upstairs to change. I didn't reach for the navy silk dress I'd tailored myself. Instead, I went to the back of the closet and pulled out a tailored charcoal power suit I'd bought in secret months ago. A suit that commanded respect. A suit that said I was no longer building a foundation for someone else. As I looked at myself in the full-length mirror, I realized that the financial storm David was so terrified of wasn't something happening to us. It was something I had invited in. And for the first time in 30 years, the wind felt like freedom. The lobby of Thorne National Bank was a cathedral of glass and steel, a place where the air tasted of cold filtration and old money. David burst through the revolving doors like a man pursued by a pack of wolves. His tie was stuffed into his pocket. His face was slick with a layer of panicked sweat, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. He didn't see the art on the walls or the hushed elegance of the tellers. He only saw the elevator bank that led to the executive suites. He was looking for Silas Thorne. He was looking for the man he believed was his only salvation, convinced that if he could just get Silas into a room, man to man, he could charm, negotiate, or lie his way out of the abyss. "Sir, you can't go up without an appointment," the receptionist called out, her voice polite but firm. David ignored her, his heavy footsteps echoing against the marble floor as he forced his way into a waiting elevator. He hammered the button for the penthouse level, his reflection in the polished brass doors revealing a man who looked decades older than he had just 12 hours ago. He was the real estate king of California, and he refused to believe that the gates to the kingdom were being locked from the inside. He thought about the board members who had blocked his calls, the contractors who were already abandoning his sites, and the terrifying frozen status on his personal bank accounts. He just needed Silas to listen. He just needed a signature. When the elevator doors chimed and opened onto the executive floor, the silence was absolute. The hallway was lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Bay Bridge, the morning fog still clinging to the water like a shroud. David marched toward the massive mahogany doors of the boardroom, his heart thumping against his ribs. He didn't knock. He shoved the doors open with a violence that spoke of his desperation, ready to launch into a practiced speech about temporary liquidity issues and decades of industry respect. "Silas, we need to talk. This default notice is a mistake, a clerical error, and I won't have my reputation dragged through—" David's voice died in his throat. The speech he had rehearsed evaporated, leaving his mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic gasp. Silas Thorne was there, but he wasn't at the head of the table. He was standing by the window, his back to the room, watching the ships in the harbor. The person sitting in the high-backed leather chair at the center of the boardroom was a woman. She was dressed in a charcoal power suit that fit her with a sharp, unforgiving precision. Her hair was swept back, revealing a face that was calm, calculated, and utterly unfamiliar to the man standing in the doorway. It was me. I sat there with my hands folded on the table, a stack of default notices and pension fund audits spread out before me like a deck of cards I had already won. "You're late, David," I said. My voice was steady, lacking the soft, submissive lilt he had spent 30 years training me to use. It was the voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime counting the cost of other people's mistakes. "And you're interrupting a very important meeting of the majority shareholders. Please, close the door. You're letting a draft in." David took a stumbling step forward, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for a hidden camera or a punchline. "Madison? What are you doing here? Why are you wearing that? Did you bring the leftovers? Did Silas tell you to wait for me here?" He let out a sharp, hysterical bark of a laugh, his mind desperately trying to shoehorn me back into the useless wife box. "Get out of that chair, Maddie. This is serious business. I need to speak with Silas immediately. Where is he?" Silas turned around then, his expression unreadable. "I'm right here, Mr. Gray," Silas said, walking toward the table. But he didn't go to the chair. He stopped beside me, placing a respectful hand on the back of my seat. "But as I told you last night, I'm merely an employee of the Thorne family legacy, the majority owner of Thorne National Bank, and therefore the primary creditor of Gray Holdings, is sitting right in front of you. You are currently speaking to the chairperson of the board." The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it might crack the glass walls. David looked at me, then at Silas, then back at the notice of immediate default resting under my palm. He saw my signature, not the shaky, unsure scrawl he had mocked on grocery receipts, but a firm, decisive stroke of ink that carried the weight of $1 billion. The realization hit him like a physical blow, his knees buckling until he had to grab the edge of the table to stay upright. "Chairperson?" David whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "But you lost the money. You lost the inheritance. You told me it was gone." "I told you what you wanted to hear, David," I replied, standing up slowly. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his with a cold, clear intensity. "You wanted a wife who was a failure so you could feel like a god. You wanted a woman who couldn't manage a checkbook so you could feel like a genius. I simply gave you the mirror you asked for. But while you were busy admiring your own reflection, I was building the bank that would eventually buy your debt." I pushed a folder toward him, the evidence of his pension fund fraud. "The question isn't why I'm here, David. The question is how quickly you can sign the resignation papers before the federal investigators arrive at your office. I'm giving you one chance to exit with a shred of dignity. Don't waste it. I've already calculated the odds, and they're not in your favor." David's fingers gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned a ghostly white, his breath coming in short, ragged hitches that whistled through the silent room. He looked at the documents spread before him, the audit reports, the foreclosure notices, the bank charter. And for the first time in his life, David Gray was looking at a reality he couldn't charm or bully into submission. His virtual empire, the one he had spent 30 years polishing like a trophy, was revealed for what it truly was: a hollow shell of debt and vanity, held together only by the silence and the secret labor of the woman he had just tried to sell for $1. "You can't do this," David croaked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. He looked at Silas, then back at me, a desperate, wild look in his eyes. "Madison, think about our life. Think about our reputation in this city. If you call in these loans, if you expose the pension fund issues, we're finished. Everything we've built, the house, the cars, the Gala, it all goes up in smoke. You'd be destroying yourself along with me. We're a team, remember? A partnership." He tried to reach for my hand, his face contorting into a mask of faux affection, a manipulative ghost of the man who had once convinced a 22-year-old girl to work 3 jobs for his dreams. I pulled my hand away with a clinical coldness that seemed to startle him more than the documents did. "We were never a partnership, David. We were a host and a parasite. You weren't building a legacy. You were consuming one. You were consuming my father's inheritance, my youth, and eventually, the very futures of your employees just to keep your stock price from dipping." I tapped the audit report with a manicured finger. "This isn't destroying ourselves. This is me performing an emergency amputation to save what's left of the values we were supposed to stand for. You bet our entire company on a yacht and a lifestyle you didn't earn. You assumed the useless wife was too busy clipping coupons to notice you were stealing from the people who actually do the work. You were wrong." Silas Thorne stepped forward, his presence as steady as a mountain. He placed a heavy fountain pen on the table, right next to the signature line of the corporate surrender and restructuring agreement. "The federal investigators are already at your headquarters, Mr. Gray," Silas said, his voice devoid of pity. "They're currently looking through the servers Madison gave them access to last night. The only reason they haven't arrived here with handcuffs is because the chairperson, your wife, has offered to settle the company's debts through a total asset liquidation. If you sign this, the Thorne Group and Thorne National Bank will take over Gray Holdings. We will use your personal assets, including the Atherton estate and the King's ransom, to replenish the employee pension fund you drained. In exchange, Madison has requested that we do not seek criminal prosecution for your creative accounting." David stared at the pen as if it were a poisonous snake. The realization that he was being offered a mercy that stripped him of every shred of his pride was a bitter pill to swallow. "You want me to just give it away? Everything I've worked for? I'm the CEO. I'm the face of this company." He looked at me, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "What are you going to do without me, Madison? You think you can run a real estate firm? You'll be back to making pot roast and counting pennies within a month. You need me to lead." I leaned back in the leather chair, the power in the room shifting so violently I could almost feel the air vibrate. "I don't need to lead a real estate firm, David. I own the bank that decides if the firm even exists. And as for your role, well, the restructuring plan has a very specific place for you. You see, you owe a debt not just to me, but to the legacy of Clara Thorne. Since you were so fond of auctioning off labor, I've decided to follow your lead." I pushed a final document toward him, an employment contract. "You will remain with the new Thorne Gray Management Group as a junior consultant. Your salary will be the minimum wage allowed by law in the state of California. Every penny above your living expenses will be garnished to pay back the interest on the debt you owed to Clara's estate. You won't have a corner office. You won't have a dedicated assistant. You'll have a cubicle and a supervisor who expects you to be on time." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of a siren on the street below. David looked down at the contract, then back at me, searching for a hint of a joke, a sign that I was just trying to scare him. But he found only the steady, unblinking gaze of a woman who had spent 30 years watching him fail upwards. He realized then that the virtual empire hadn't just collapsed. It had been dismantled piece by piece, and he was the only one who hadn't seen it coming. With a hand that shook so violently he had to steady it with his other, David picked up the pen. He signed his name, the signature that once closed billion-dollar deals, on a document that officially made him an entry-level employee in a company he used to own. The clatter of the pen hitting the table felt like a period at the end of a long, exhausting chapter. David slumped back, looking defeated, his identity as the real estate king erased by a single stroke of ink. He was no longer a titan. He was just a man in an expensive suit he could no longer afford, sitting in a room owned by the woman he had called useless. I stood up, smoothing my suit jacket, and looked at Silas. "The transition team is ready?" I asked. Silas nodded. "They're waiting in the lobby, Chairperson." I turned to David one last time, my expression one of quiet, resolved peace. "Go home, David. Pack a bag. The house is being listed for sale tomorrow. I've arranged for a small apartment for you near the office. It's 600 square feet, roughly the size of our first place in Oakland. I thought you might appreciate the nostalgia." A week after the signatures dried on the restructuring documents, I stood on the private balcony of my new office at the top of the Thorne National Bank building. Below me, San Francisco was a mosaic of gray fog and gold sunlight, the city breathing with a rhythm I finally felt a part of. The air up here was crisp and clean, miles away from the stifling, perfume-choked atmosphere of the Fairmont ballroom. I took a sip of tea from a simple ceramic mug, not the fine bone china David used to insist upon, and felt a profound, quiet sense of peace. The useless wife was gone, and in her place stood a woman whose name now carried more weight than the man who had tried to sell her for $1. The transition had been swift and surgical. The Atherton estate was already under contract, its cold marble halls soon to be filled by a new family who, I hoped, would bring more love to it than we ever did. The King's Ransom yacht had been sold to a Mediterranean charter company, the proceeds immediately flowing into the employee pension fund to bridge the gap David had created. Every piece of the Gray Empire was being dismantled and repurposed, forged into something that actually served the people who built it. I watched the numbers settle on my screen each morning, not with the greed David once possessed, but with the satisfaction of a craftsman seeing a crooked wall finally made straight. Integrity, I realized, isn't just a moral choice. It's the only foundation that doesn't eventually crumble under its own weight. I had seen David only once since the board meeting. I was walking through the operations floor of the new management group, headed toward a briefing with Silas. There, in a sea of gray cubicles and fluorescent lights, sat the former real estate king. He was hunched over a stack of entry-level appraisal reports, his Italian suit looking out of place in the cramped workspace. He looked up as I passed, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was no mockery left in him, no arrogant sneer. There was only a profound, hollow confusion. He was finally doing the work I had done in the shadows for 30 years. The meticulous, unglamorous, essential labor that keeps a life from falling apart. He was learning, at 54 years old, what it actually means to earn $1. I didn't feel a surge of hate or even a thrill of revenge. I simply felt finished. Silas Thorne joined me on the balcony, leaning against the railing. He didn't speak for a long time, allowing the silence of the city to settle between us. "My mother would have loved this view," he said eventually, his voice a low rumble of contentment. "She always said that the best part of climbing a mountain isn't looking down at where you were, but looking out at where you can go next." He handed me a small framed photograph he'd found in Clara's belongings. It was a picture of the old bakery in Oakland, taken a month after I'd sent the anonymous investment. Clara was standing in the doorway, flower on her apron, smiling with a radiance that could light up a dark street. On the back she had written, "To the angel who saw me, I am building this for us." I looked at the photo and felt a tear finally escape, rolling down my cheek. Not a tear of sorrow, but one of release. My father's inheritance hadn't been lost in a tech venture or wasted on vanity. It had been planted in the soil of a stranger's dream, and it had grown into a forest that was now sheltering thousands. That was the American dream my father had taught me. Not the flashy cars or the gold-leafed ballrooms, but the quiet, relentless power of doing the right thing when no one is watching. David thought he was the architect of his life, but he was just a tenant in a house built by my character. I didn't need to scream to be heard. My silence and my actions did all the talking. Hard work and integrity always find their way back to the light. I think about that dollar David held up on the stage, and I smile. He was right about one thing. Everything has a price. He just didn't realize that his price was his soul, and mine was a freedom I've been earning one day at a time for 30 years. I am no longer the woman standing in the shadows of a spotlight. I am the one who controls the power. Thank you for walking this path with me today. If this story touched your heart, please like the video and share your own thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where the truth finally set you free? I'd love to hear your stories of resilience and rebirth. Stay strong, stay true to who you are, and remember, your value is never determined by someone else's inability to see it.